You know, when we talk about the American frontier, we always focus on the gold rushes, the gunfights, the wagon trains heading west. But there's this other story, this quieter revolution that happened in the mountains of Wyoming in the 1820s that nobody really talks about anymore. And it all started with a mountain man, a dog, and a blizzard that should have killed them both. This is the story of how a chance discovery changed everything about how Americans built their homes, their businesses, their entire civilization moving west. Because before you can have settlers, before you can have towns, you need one thing above all else. You need to keep the rain out. The winter of 1823. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, if you've ever been caught in a real mountain blizzard, not the kind you drive through in your heated car, but the kind where the wind actually steals the breath from your lungs, then you have maybe 5% of the understanding of what Ezekiel Harper was facing that February morning. The temperature had dropped so fast that his breath crystallized before it left his beard. We're talking about the kind of cold that makes you wonder if hell might actually be frozen, not burning. Zeke was 42 years old, which in 1823 mountain man years meant he was ancient. Most trappers were dead by 35, and he was lost, completely, utterly lost in the worst blizzard the Rockies had seen in living memory. The Shoshone elders would later say it was a once-in-a-generation storm, the kind their grandfathers told stories about. But Zeke had one advantage that kept him breathing: thunder. Thunder was a mastiff, and when I say mastiff, I don't mean like the dogs you see at the park. This animal weighed close to 200 pounds of muscle and fur, and seemed completely unbothered by conditions that were killing his human companion. Dogs like Thunder were worth their weight in beaver pelts on the frontier, because they could fight bears, pull sleds, and most importantly, they could sense things humans couldn't. And Thunder sensed something now. The dog kept pulling northwest, against the wind, against all logic. Zeke had learned over their 6 years together to trust the animal's instincts. Thunder had saved his life before, pulling him back from a hidden crevasse, alerting him to a grisly den before he stumbled into it. So when Thunder planted his feet and refused to go any direction except northwest, Zeke followed. Here's what's fascinating. Thunder was following markers that had been placed there hundreds of years before by native peoples. Not obvious signs, not blazes on trees, but subtle arrangements of stones, certain bent branches that only someone who knew what to look for could see. And somehow, through the screaming white chaos of the blizzard, Thunder could sense them. Dogs can smell things we can't even imagine, can detect changes in the earth itself. The Shoshone had created a trail system through these mountains that worked with the natural world, and Thunder's nose was translating it. They stumbled forward for what felt like days but was probably only hours. Zeke's feet had gone from painful to numb, which he knew was exactly when you were supposed to panic. Frostbite was already claiming his toes. His fingers were useless inside his mittens. He was at that stage of hypothermia where you start thinking about just sitting down in the snow just for a minute, just to rest. And that's when Thunder found it. The wind suddenly died, which made no meteorological sense at all. One moment the blizzard was trying to peel the skin from Zeke's face, and the next they were in this pocket of relative calm. The snow was still falling, but straight down now, almost peaceful. And the smell hit him. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was strong and unmistakable. That petroleum smell, that distinctive odor that modern people would recognize from asphalt, from tar, from road construction. But Zeke had never smelled anything like it before in his life. Thunder had led them to a series of pools, and here's the really remarkable thing. They were warm. In the middle of a killing freeze, these pools were giving off heat, actual visible steam rising into the frozen air. The black liquid bubbled up from somewhere deep in the earth, thick and viscous, collecting in natural depressions in the rock. The Shoshone had known about these seeps for generations beyond counting. They were sacred places because they recognized that this black substance had power. They used small amounts of it, mixed with other materials for waterproofing, for medicine, for ceremonies. The pools were protected, guarded, considered a gift from the earth that needed to be respected, not exploited. Zeke knew enough about native territories to realize he was somewhere he probably shouldn't be, but he was also dying of cold, and those warm pools represented survival. He made a choice that would change everything. He approached the largest pool, and Thunder followed, and they both felt the heat radiating from the earth. The dog did something strange then. Thunder walked right to the edge of the black liquid and just sat down, staring at it, almost transfixed. His tail wasn't wagging. He wasn't excited. He was focused in a way Zeke had never seen before, like the animal understood something fundamental about what they'd found. Zeke built a fire using pine branches sheltered by the rock formations, and as he thawed, he watched Thunder watch the tar, and he started thinking, because back at the settlements, back at the trading posts and the pathetic excuse for towns they were building out here, people were losing everything to water damage. Roofs leaked, walls rotted. The frontier economy was hemorrhaging money and materials because nobody could figure out how to keep the weather out. Zeke had seen it himself. Nearly half of all structures built in the territories needed major repairs or complete rebuilding within 2 years. 40%. Think about that. Imagine building your house, your store, your fort, and knowing that in 2 years the rain and snow would probably destroy it. That was the reality of frontier life. And here, bubbling up from the earth like some kind of miracle, was a substance that repelled water, that stayed flexible in cold, that sealed gaps. The natives already knew. They'd known for longer than white men had been on this continent. As night fell and the blizzard finally began to ease, Zeke made a decision. He would come back here. He would figure out how to use this black gold. And standing there by the warm pools with Thunder lying beside him, both of them alive when they should have been frozen corpses somewhere in the snow, Ezekiel Harper had no idea that he'd just discovered the secret that would make possible the entire western expansion of the United States. But first, he had to survive until morning, and then he had to figure out how to find this place again. Because somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, he could swear he heard voices, the sound of people moving through the trees, and he realized that he and Thunder might not be alone. Those voices in the darkness turned out to be Shoshone hunters who had been tracking the same storm, watching for travelers foolish enough to be caught out in it. They found Zeke and Thunder by the tar pools at dawn, and there was this moment, this suspended instant where everyone was deciding whether violence was about to happen or not. But here's the thing about survival on the frontier. Sometimes shared hardship creates unexpected alliances. The eldest hunter, a man Zeke would later know as Runs Far, spoke enough trade language to make himself understood. And what he said was remarkable. You should be dead. The dog brought you here. The earth saved you. This means something. The Shoshone had a philosophy about the tar seeps that Zeke would spend months learning to understand. They believed the black liquid was medicine from deep in the world's body, meant to be used sparingly, with respect, with gratitude. Taking too much would anger the spirits. Taking just enough, with the right intentions, was acceptable. It was a completely different worldview from the extractive, take-everything approach that would come to define American industry. But in that moment, freezing and exhausted, Zeke made a promise. If he used what he'd found, he would share the benefits. He didn't know if he meant it, not really, but he said the words, and Runs Far accepted them, and they let him leave with a small clay pot filled with the black tar and instructions on how to find the place again when spring came. Spring of 1824 arrived like a miracle after that brutal winter. Zeke spent weeks in his cabin experimenting with the tar, and this is where it gets interesting from a technical standpoint. The raw tar was too thick, too viscous to work with effectively. It needed to be cut with something, modified, made into something more useful. And this is where those whispered native formulas came in. Bear fat, pine resin, specific ratios mixed at specific temperatures over specific types of fires. This wasn't science as we understand it today, but it was generations of accumulated knowledge, trial and error, observation and refinement. The Shoshone hadn't written it down because their knowledge was oral, passed from teacher to student, grandmother to granddaughter. But they'd figured out something that would take Eastern chemists another decade to understand. Petroleum compounds could be modified into different useful forms depending on what you mixed them with. Zeke's first successful batch took him 47 attempts. 47. He filled his entire cabin with FTV, failed experiments, mixtures that stayed liquid in the cold, mixtures that became brittle and cracked, mixtures that never quite set, mixtures that smelled so bad he had to bury them 100 yards away. Thunder learned to stay outside during these experiments after getting tar in his fur that took weeks to work out. But batch 48 worked. It was flexible. It was water-resistant. It didn't crack in the cold or melt in moderate heat. You could spread it on wood, on leather, on fabric, and it would seal the material against moisture while remaining pliable. Zeke had just invented something that the modern world would eventually call asphalt sealant, though he had no idea what to call it except black gold. Now here's where Zeke showed himself to be more than just a lucky mountain man. A lot of trappers would have tried to hoard this discovery, keep it secret, use it only for themselves. But Zeke understood something fundamental about frontier economics. You couldn't get rich by yourself out here. You needed customers. You needed a market. You needed other people to want what you had. Fort Bridger was the first. Old Jim Bridger himself was skeptical until Zeke waterproofed half the fort's storage buildings in exchange for credit at the trading post. That winter, while other forts lost 30 to 40% of their stored goods to water damage and mold, Fort Bridger lost less than 5%. 5. The competitive advantage was so massive that traders started routing through Bridger specifically because they knew their goods would stay dry. Word spreads fast on the frontier, especially word about money, about advantage, about something that works. By fall of 1824, Zeke had more customers than he could handle. He was traveling between settlements with Thunder, carrying his tar mixture in sealed containers, teaching people how to apply it, and charging prices that made him wealthy by mountain man standards. But here's what nobody expected. The women saw it first. The women saw what this stuff could really do. Mary O'Sullivan was an Irish immigrant who'd come west after her husband died of cholera. She ran a boarding house in a settlement that doesn't exist anymore, and she was constantly battling water damage, leaking roofs, rotting floorboards, mildewed walls. When Zeke showed up with his black gold, Mary saw beyond just waterproofing buildings. She started experimenting with her own mixtures, creating thinner versions that could waterproof canvas tents, leather boots, wagon covers. She developed a paste that women could use on their clothes to waterproof their hems and cloaks. Within 6 months, Mary O'Sullivan was running her own tar-based products business, and she was making more money than most men on the frontier. Other women followed: seamstresses, laundresses, merchants. They understood that this wasn't just about keeping roofs dry. This was about keeping everything dry, protecting the few possessions people owned, extending the life of expensive items like boots and coats. The summer of 1825 brought a confrontation that could have ended everything. Crow warriors, understandably upset that their territorial rivals, the Shoshone, seemed to have exclusive access to the tar seeps, intercepted Zeke on one of his collection trips. There were 12 of them, all armed, all angry, and Zeke was very much alone except for Thunder. What happened next wasn't noble or peaceful, or anything like the sanitized versions you might read in history books. There was shouting. There were weapons drawn. Thunder went into full protective mode, which for a 200-pound mastiff meant he became absolutely terrifying. But somewhere in the chaos, Zeke remembered his promise to Runsfar. Share the benefits. He offered them a deal: access to the tar, training on how to process it, and a percentage of his profits in exchange for protection and guaranteed passage through Crow territory. It was audacious. It was probably stupid. But it worked. The Crow leader, a man named Two Feathers, saw the same thing Zeke had seen. This black gold was worth more as a shared resource than as something to fight over. That alliance changed the entire dynamic of the tar trade. With both Shoshone and Crow actively involved in extraction and processing, production increased 5-fold. Different tribes brought their own variations on the processing formulas, creating specialized products for different applications. It became, briefly, a model of how indigenous knowledge and settler economics could work together for mutual benefit. Of course, it wouldn't last. These things never did on the American frontier, but for a few years it functioned. Back east, Industrialists heard rumors about this miracle waterproofing substance and immediately wanted to control it. Several attempted to recreate the formulas using synthetic methods, chemical processes they'd imported from European manufacturers. They failed spectacularly. One Boston factory, run by a man named Thaddeus Blackwell who was convinced he could synthesize tar from coal, created an unstable mixture that exploded when they tried to heat it to make it flow better. The explosion killed 12 workers, injured 30 more, and burned down 3 city blocks. The newspapers reported it as an industrial accident. They didn't mention that Blackwell had been trying to steal Native American formulas, or that his arrogance about the superiority of Eastern chemistry over frontier knowledge had literally blown up in his face. But word got around. The people who mattered, the investors and the speculators, they learned a lesson. You couldn't fake this. You couldn't synthesize it with the technology of the time. If you wanted the real black gold, you had to deal with the man who controlled the source. And that man was getting very, very wealthy. By 1826, Ezekiel Harper owned 3 cabins, had accounts at 4 different trading posts, and was being called Sir by men who 2 years earlier wouldn't have shared a campfire with him. Thunder was getting fat on fresh meat and table scraps, living better than most frontier families. But wealth attracts attention, and attention, on the American frontier, was often violent. Because while Zeke was building his empire on black gold, other men were watching, learning, and planning. Men with private armies, men with political connections, men who believed that anything valuable should belong to whoever was strong enough to take it. The peace couldn't last forever. And when it broke, the Black Gold Wars would make everything that came before look like a gentle disagreement. The thing about wealth on the American frontier is that it never stays peaceful for long. If you've got something valuable, someone else wants to take it. And if you've got something that everybody needs, like waterproofing in a climate that destroys buildings, well, then you've got yourself a war waiting to happen. Enter Marcus Thompson, Tar King Thompson as he would come to be called, though he preferred just King Thompson. This man was everything Zeke wasn't, formally educated, politically connected, and absolutely convinced that natural resources should be controlled by men of vision and capital, which meant him. Thompson showed up in the territories in 1827 with something unprecedented, a private army, 40 men, professional fighters, not trappers or traders, but actual mercenaries who'd fought in various conflicts back east and were now being paid to secure tar deposits by any means necessary. Thompson's strategy was brutally simple. He'd locate tar seeps, usually by following Zeke's traders or bribing native informants. Then he'd fortify the location with his men and claim exclusive extraction rights. He had lawyers, he had documents, he had guns, and for a while, it worked. By 1828, Thompson controlled 7 major tar deposits across 3 territories, and he was charging prices that made Zeke's look charitable. But here's what Thompson didn't understand about frontier economics. You can't monopolize a resource if the people who know where it is refuse to work with you. And Thompson had made enemies of everyone who mattered. The Shoshone wouldn't deal with him. The Crow wouldn't deal with him. Even white trappers and traders who had no love for native peoples wouldn't deal with him because Thompson's prices were strangling the entire frontier economy. Then there was Isabella Cortez. If Thompson was the hammer, Isabella was the lockpick. She showed up in St. Louis in 1829, claiming to be a widow from Santa Fe, looking to start a trading business. She was beautiful, she was charming, and she spoke 4 languages fluently. She was also a spy working for a consortium of Mexican businessmen who wanted access to the tar formulas for their own territorial expansion. Isabella did what spies do. She befriended people, learned their secrets, and disappeared in the night with information worth fortunes. She got close to Mary O'Sullivan, learned her processing techniques. She seduced one of Thompson's lieutenants and learned his extraction locations. She even spent 3 weeks at a Crow encampment, claiming to be interested in native culture while actually documenting their specialized formulas. The woman was brilliant, dangerous, and almost succeeded in stealing the entire tar trade's intellectual property. Almost. Because Thunder's puppies stopped her. See, by 1829, Thunder had sired multiple litters, and his offspring had inherited that same mysterious ability to sense tar deposits. These dogs were selling for prices that would make your head spin. $1,000 for a proven tar detection dog. That's roughly equivalent to $30,000 today. Breeding operations became serious businesses, with detailed pedigrees and training programs. If you had a dog that could reliably find new tar seeps, you were set for life. Isabella tried to buy one of Thunder's sons, a massive brute named Echo, from a trapper named Dutch Henry. But Dutch Henry had his own plans. He'd been following Echo across the territories, mapping every tar deposit the dog found, creating what amounted to a treasure map of black gold. When Isabella offered him $5,000 for the dog and the map, Dutch Henry took her money, gave her a different dog entirely, and disappeared into the mountains with Echo and the real information. Isabella spent 6 months following false leads before she realized she'd been conned. By then, Dutch Henry had sold his actual map to Zeke for a partnership stake, and Zeke had used that information to outmaneuver Thompson at every turn. Every time Thompson thought he'd cornered the market, new tar deposits would open up, breaking his stranglehold on supply. The conflict escalated through 1830 and 1831. Thompson's men clashed with independent operators. There were shootings, sabotage, one memorable incident where someone contaminated Thompson's entire St. Louis warehouse with pine pitch that made his tar unusable. Nobody ever proved who did it, but Mary O'Sullivan was seen smiling for weeks afterward. Then came the Great St. Louis Fire of 1833, and everything changed. It started in a tobacco warehouse on a hot August afternoon. Exact cause was never determined, but within an hour, half the riverfront was burning. St. Louis, in 1833, was mostly wood construction, and fires were the nightmare scenario that everybody dreaded but nobody was really prepared for. The wind was blowing hard from the west, pushing flames toward the commercial district where most of the city's wealth was concentrated. But here's the remarkable thing. There was a line of buildings that had been waterproofed with Zeke's tar mixture. 7 warehouses and a hotel, all treated within the previous year. When the fire reached them, something unexpected happened. The tar didn't burn the way wood burned. It smoldered, it heated, but it didn't create the kind of explosive combustion that was destroying untreated structures. Those buildings essentially created a fire break, a barrier that slowed the fire's advance long enough for bucket brigades to get organized and create real fire breaks by demolishing structures in the fire's path. St. Louis lost 53 buildings that day. They should have lost 200. The treated structures saved the commercial heart of the city, and overnight, tar waterproofing went from being a nice luxury to being essential infrastructure. Within a month, every major settlement west of the Mississippi was ordering tar by the barrel for fire resistance, not just waterproofing. The railroad barons noticed. These men were planning transcontinental routes, envisioning the future of American expansion, and they realized something crucial. Whoever controlled the tar controlled where railroads could safely build stations, warehouses, and maintenance facilities. They needed buildings that could survive the weather and resist fire, and there was only one substance that provided both. Cornelius Hammond, representing a coalition of railroad investors, came to Zeke in 1834 with an offer. Sell them exclusive rights to all tar deposits. Name your price. It was more money than a mountain man could imagine. More money than Zeke's grandchildren's grandchildren would ever need. Life-changing, dynasty-building wealth. Zeke, sitting in his cabin with old Thunder sleeping by the fire, thought about it for exactly one night, and then he said no. Instead, he did something that nobody expected, and that historians still argue about today. He broke up his holdings. He sold stakes in different tar deposits to different operators, creating competition to preventing monopoly control. He gave shares to native partners, to Mary O'Sullivan, and other entrepreneurs, to independent traders. He kept enough for himself to remain wealthy, but he deliberately fragmented the market to prevent anyone from doing what Thompson had tried to do. Was it idealism? Business strategy? Spite toward the railroad barons? Nobody knows for certain. But the result was that tar remained accessible, prices stayed reasonable, and the western expansion happened with waterproofing materials available to ordinary settlers, not just wealthy corporations. Thompson's empire collapsed by 1835. Without monopoly control, his high-overhead operation couldn't compete with smaller, more efficient operators. Isabella Cortez disappeared from history, probably back to Mexico with whatever secrets she'd managed to acquire. Dutch Henry became a minor legend, the man who'd mapped half the Rocky Mountain tar deposits and then sold that information for a comfortable retirement. And Ezekiel Harper became frontier royalty, not because he was the richest man in the territories, though he was wealthy, but because he'd figured out how to balance profit with principle in a place where most men chose one or the other. He was invited to territorial councils. His opinions shaped policy. People named their children after him. At 54 years old, he was an elder statesman of the frontier, respected by settlers and native peoples alike. But he never forgot where it all started, with a dog, a blizzard, and warm black pools in the mountains. And he never told anyone about the 3 other tar deposits that Thunder had found over the years, the ones he'd kept secret, hidden in his diary for reasons known only to himself. Those secrets would stay buried for another decade, waiting for the right moment, the right purpose. Because Zeke understood something fundamental about power. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can possess is something nobody knows you have. By the 1840s, the American West was changing so fast that men, who'd been there for 20 years, barely recognized it anymore. Settlements that had been 3 cabins and a trading post were becoming actual towns with streets, churches, schools. The Oregon Trail was bringing thousands of families west every year, and the California Gold Rush was about to bring thousands more. The frontier was filling up, civilization was marching westward, and underneath all of it, literally holding it together, was Zeke's black gold. Think about what waterproofing meant in practical terms. Before tar-based sealants became widely available, building anything permanent west of the Mississippi was almost impossible. You could put up a structure, but within 2 years the weather would start destroying it. Rain would rot the wood, snow would collapse roofs, ice would crack foundations. The 40% failure rate I mentioned earlier wasn't an exaggeration. It was the brutal reality of frontier construction. But by 1845, that had changed completely. Towns across the territories were building structures designed to last decades, not years. Waterproofed roofs, sealed foundations, protected walls. The economic impact was staggering. Instead of constantly rebuilding, settlers could invest in improvements, expansions, and futures. A farmer could build a barn knowing it would still be standing for his children. A merchant could construct a warehouse confident that his inventory wouldn't be destroyed by the next storm season. This is how empires are actually built, by the way. Not through dramatic battles or heroic expeditions, though those make better stories. Empires are built through infrastructure, through solving the boring problems that make civilization possible. Zeke's tar did for the American West what Roman concrete did for the Roman Empire. It made permanent construction feasible in hostile environments. And Thunder's bloodline? Those dogs became legends in their own right. By the late 1840s, there were dozens of documented tar-detecting dogs across the territories, all descended from Thunder through various breeding lines. The most famous was a female named Storm, owned by a Shoshone family, who reportedly found 17 new tar deposits in her lifetime. These weren't just working dogs. They were valuable assets, insured, protected, bred with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for thoroughbred horses. The breeding operations became sophisticated businesses. Trainers developed methods to test young dogs for the tar-sensing ability, to strengthen it through selective breeding, to document bloodlines. Some of these breeding records still exist in archives, meticulous logs showing which dogs produced the most reliable offspring, which training methods worked best, which families had the touch for raising tar detectors. A proven tar dog in 1848 could sell for $2,000. $2,000. That's close to $70,000 in modern money for a dog. And people paid it because finding new tar deposits meant wealth, security, opportunity. The dogs weren't just pets or tools. They were keys to the future. Zeke watched all this happen from his comfortable position as frontier royalty. He was 63 years old in 1849, ancient by mountain man standards, wealthy beyond anything he'd imagined as a young trapper. He had a proper house now, with multiple rooms and glass windows, and a roof that absolutely did not leak. He had investments in trading posts, shares in tar operations, more money in banks back east than he would ever spend, and he had Thunder. Old Thunder, 16 years old, grey-muzzled and arthritic, barely able to walk some mornings but still alive, still present, still the dog who'd saved Zeke's life in that blizzard so long ago. In the spring of 1849, Zeke made a decision. He wanted to see it again. The original Seeps, the place where it all started. The site had been developed into a full industrial operation by then, with permanent buildings and workers and equipment. It wasn't wild anymore, wasn't secret. But Zeke needed to go back. The journey took 3 weeks, which was ridiculous because Thunder could barely walk and Zeke wasn't much better. They moved slowly, camping often, following trails that were now well-established roads. People recognized them, the legend and his legendary dog, making one last pilgrimage. When they arrived at the original tar seeps, Zeke spent a long time just sitting there with Thunder, looking at what the place had become. The warm pools were still there, still bubbling up from deep in the earth, but they were surrounded by collection infrastructure now. Workers were extracting tar systematically, processing it according to formulas that had been refined over decades. It was efficient, it was productive. It was completely different from the desperate frozen night when Thunder had first led him here. That evening, sitting by the fire with Thunder's head resting on his lap, Zeke made his final contribution to the tar trade. He opened his diary, the journal he'd been keeping since his first trapping days, and he wrote down the locations of 3 tar deposits that he'd never told anyone about. Thunder had found them over the years, and Zeke had mapped them carefully but kept them secret. Hidden reserves, insurance against some future need that had never materialized. The first deposit was in a canyon that would later become part of Wyoming. The second was on Crow Land, specifically chosen so that native partners would benefit from its eventual discovery. The third was the largest, a massive seep in territory that would become Montana, bigger than any deposit yet found. Zeke sealed the diary and gave specific instructions. It was to be held by a trusted lawyer back east and opened only after his death, with the information shared equally among his native partners, Mary O'Sullivan's descendants, and the territorial governments. Not sold to the highest bidder, not monopolized, but distributed to ensure the benefits spread as widely as possible. Thunder died that summer, peacefully in his sleep, which was more than most frontier dogs got. Zeke buried him on a hillside, overlooking the original tar seeps, with a stone marker that simply read, "Thunder, found the way." Zeke himself lasted another 5 years, dying in 1854 at the age of 68, which was practically biblical longevity for a mountain man. His diary was opened as instructed, and those 3 secret deposits became major extraction sites that funded schools, hospitals, and infrastructure across the territories. But here's the legacy that matters most, the impact that goes beyond economics and infrastructure. Tar-based waterproofing made it possible to preserve documents in frontier conditions. State constitutions were written on paper, sealed with tar-based treatments that protected them from moisture. Legal documents, land deeds, personal letters, all survived because they could be kept dry. The written record of Western expansion exists because of Zeke's discovery. Early photography required dry storage. Those iconic images of the Old West, the photographs that captured what the frontier actually looked like, they survived because photographers could build darkrooms with waterproof roofs and sealed storage rooms. Visual history was preserved. And schools. Frontier schools needed dry buildings where books could be stored, where paper and ink wouldn't be destroyed by moisture, where children could learn year-round regardless of weather. The generation of Americans who grew up in the 1840s and 50s, who became the lawyers and doctors and engineers and teachers of the post-Civil War era, they were educated in buildings made possible by tar waterproofing. Ezekiel Harper's name doesn't appear in many history books. Thunder doesn't have monuments. The Black Gold Wars aren't taught in schools. But every time you see an old photograph from the frontier, every time you read a preserved document from Western history, every time you think about how American civilization expanded across a continent, you're seeing the legacy of a mountain man, his dog, and a discovery made during the worst blizzard in living memory. Sometimes the most important revolutions are the quiet ones, the ones that simply make ordinary life possible. And sometimes the heroes are the ones who share their discoveries rather than hoarding them, who build systems rather than empires, who understand that the greatest legacy isn't what you keep for yourself, but what you leave behind for everyone else. That's the story of how one mountain man's dog led him to the secret material that made roofs waterproof, and in doing so, helped build a nation.